How do I figure out what's next in my career? How do I align my work with what truly matters to me? And the biggest question of all, can I really design a career that I love? Hey, my name is Jen Smith, and I believe career success doesn't have to come at the expense of living a radiantly happy and healthy lifestyle. As a former HR leader and recruiter turned career coach, I've seen how traditional paths can leave people burned out or boxed in. And I know there's a better way, one that invites you to let go of outdated rules and outside expectations, one that evolves and supports meaningful growth over time. Whether you're feeling stuck, craving more clarity, or ready to expand within your current role and beyond, this show is for you. So grab your coffee or your kombucha, pull up a seat, and get ready to explore practical, modern strategies for building a meaningful, heart-based career. Because you deserve a long, radiantly happy, and healthy career. This is the Flourish Careers Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Flourish Careers Podcast. I'm Jen Smith, your host, and today I'm thrilled to be here for another installment of Flourishing Together. This is a segment dedicated to curated conversations with industry insiders sharing wisdom and strategies for improving your work and well-being. Today, I am so delighted to introduce Akua Nyame-Mensah. Akua is a certified executive coach, leadership advisor, small business owner, and former startup executive. With more than 2,000 hours of coaching and facilitation experience, her approaches are grounded in real-world leadership. Through her signature program and advisory work, Akua empowers leaders to build impactful, resilient businesses led with authenticity, embracing adaptability, and cultivating high-performing teams. Today, we're talking about something that I think will feel really grounding for many of you listening. So often, our careers, we are taught to think in straight lines, climb the ladder, push harder, keep going. But what if career and leadership and growth didn't actually work that way? And I love how Akua teaches that leadership is a cycle and growth is a cycle, just like nature is a cycle. And understanding where you are in that cycle can completely change how you navigate growth and overwhelm and all the things you go through in your career and as a leader. Akua, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. And you have a very interesting background and career story that we talked about when we first met. So I'd love to start at the beginning. What first led you to see leadership growth as a cycle rather than a ladder? A lot of us think of leadership as a ladder or as this linear path. And was there kind of a moment or a story in your career where that linear progression story kind of stopped making sense for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I guess I just have a really, really strange career journey in many ways. If I look back to college and where I did my first master's, you would have thought this woman knows where she's going. So I went to school. My first degree was in growth and structure of cities. Both my parents, funny enough, have degrees in urban planning. I've always been really interested in development in the physical world, specifically development. And so I knew going to school, this was something I was going to major in. The school I went to, so I went to Bryn Mawr College, is the only school I know that has this particular program. And then I specifically also knew that I wanted to do this accelerated master's in city planning at UPenn. And so I went into school being very clear about what I wanted to study, loving actually what I wanted to study, and then went to grad school. Also loved it to some extent, didn't necessarily like, or maybe I wasn't ready to take full advantage of my master's, but sort of came out of my master's program being like, oh my gosh, not only am I not sure I really want to do this, but no one is hiring for this. And I came out at a time where I guess technically it was a depression. I do think it was an economic depression. So I came out of school in 2011. That's when I got finished my master's at Penn. And so had to find something to do. And so the closest thing I could find to do at the time was an AmeriCorps position in environmental education. So I moved from the East Coast of the U.S. to the West Coast of the U.S., and for about 11 months was doing a lot of work with watershed education, was doing a lot of volunteer support work. I worked at a conservation district. It was really cool, but quite different to some extent from what I went to school with. But what I saw through that was that you can translate, or a lot of the things that I enjoyed had less to do with specific titles or even specific positions, and it just had more to do with what are different things that sort of bring me joy, that I have strengths in, that I'm excited to get up and do day to day. And so though initially I was very sort of disappointed that I couldn't find an opportunity in like what I went to school for and I'd spent all this time and energy in, ultimately I really enjoyed that opportunity. And then the next opportunity I had actually brought me back to West Africa. My brother helped me get I guess a graduate was considered a graduate internship at I guess it was sort of a USAID project, which is a weird thing to say because USAID doesn't exist anymore. But it was a project that was funded by USAID. And once again, it wasn't city planning, but I was able to leverage some of the skills and some of the things that I'd learned through my city planning program. Initially, they were very interested in me because I had focused in land use and environmental planning in my master's degree, and I'd done a lot of GIS work. And so they wanted me to help with GIS work. Did I end up doing any GIS work? No. However, that is what made them very excited about working with me. And also the next opportunity I got at another USA project was also because of these skills that I had built that could be translated and used in different ways. And so as you can see, I've had a very non-traditional sort of career journey because after that next opportunity, I think I worked for another organization for a short period of time where I was actually doing more like event management. So once again, just leveraging my really strong organizational skills. I love telling people what to do. I've been doing it for a really long time. And then that transitioned into getting an opportunity to work for I guess you can say a clone factory, a startup, a group that had a bunch of different startup platforms or businesses, and I was hired to launch one of them. Once again, wow. I didn't have a background in business. However, they were like, "Oh, you have a degree in city planning." Specifically, they wanted me to help, and I did help launch a real estate classifieds portal. And they're like, "It's kind of similar," and I was like, "Okay, I need a job." It paid well, and I had really strong organizational skills, could tell people what to do, and I sort of ended up in this, I would say, general management position. Once again, very different for what I went to school with, very different from a lot of the other sort of opportunities I had. However, a lot of my skills and then my interests and then sort of my strengths were really able to come to life through this. And so for me, I think when I look back on this experience, and once again, that wasn't a very long period of time. I think in total, I've probably only had about probably 5 years of like real full-time regular work experience because from, beyond that, it was like internships, volunteer work, and then working for myself now. But when I reflect back on sort of that journey, I think it's very similar to sort of how I think about leadership. It wasn't about thinking that I had to have that next best title or the opportunity necessarily had to give me more money or I had to get more in return for climbing up some sort of ladder. It was more about, okay, this seems really interesting. I could leverage X, Y, and Z. I could learn X, Y, and Z. And learning and growth is actually one of my main values. And so that's really knowing at the time, maybe I didn't know this, maybe like intuitively, unconsciously, maybe I knew this. Yep. I think it's maybe taken me some time and becoming someone who supports people through coaching to be able to identify this for myself. But growth is a huge thing for me. And as I look back at all these opportunities, I can see those commonalities. Like I realized like, hey, I wanted to wake up and do this. It was really interesting. I was learning new things and I was able to try and use those things almost immediately. And so all these opportunities I've had over the years allow me to do that. And so similar to what I call sort of this leadership cycle, I was constantly sort of checking in. And once again, I think at the time I was probably doing this very unconsciously. Like, hey, do I like this, right? Cultivating my awareness around it, deciding how I wanted to shift. So sort of engaging with it and then ultimately like calibrating my expectations to like, I know it's like unusual. It's not what I went to school for. However, it kind of seems like it works.
Definitely.
I'm excited to go to work and I'm getting some sort of financial return ultimately, right? This is a really great opportunity.
Yes. And I'm so grateful that you shared your background with us. And I love non-traditional paths. And because in our world of work today, I think that's really what careers are. They're all about experiences and leveraging our strengths and our interests and what brings us joy and our values in order to create those experiences, to spend our time, and then in return, the financial return for that. And so I love how you explain that, and you kind of figured that out through your early career, which I think a lot of us are still trying to figure that out. So I think it's really interesting just to kind of hear that, and also hear around the cycle. And so it doesn't have to be this linear path. Like, I went to school for urban planning, so I have to get a job, entry-level job as a specialist, and then move to the manager, and then move to the, director, and then move to the VP. It doesn't have to be that way. And you can use, clearly here, this is a great example of using different things that you went to school for in different areas of your career. And I think it's so hard. We're so young when we go to college and have to make those choices. It's so hard to know what you want to do with the rest of your life, right?
And sometimes market forces don't allow it to match.
Exactly.
Do I love talking about cities? Yes.
Yeah.
Could I talk for days about it? 100%. Could I find an opportunity that I thought made sense? No. And still today, I don't think I could. A lot of the opportunities, unfortunately, that do this type of work, they are not well paid. They're incredibly bureaucratic, and they're not a really good match for my disposition or character or personality, or however you want to define it.
Yeah. And that's okay. That's okay. That's the beauty of careers. You figure it out as you go, and you get those experiences. And that's really what it's all about. So, and I also love that you kind of took the time to reflect back and think about, like, okay, I didn't realize it at the time, but I really value growth and learning. And so, the different opportunities that came my way allowed for that. And you can kind of connect the dots backward in order to connect kind of make the best next decision forward. So that was really interesting to hear about too. So thanks for sharing that with us. Now, for somebody hearing about a leadership cycle for the first time, how would you describe the different stages? I know you have a page, and we could put that in the show notes as well, but do you mind explaining this? Because I think it's really interesting for folks to hear.
Yeah. Maybe I'll share a little bit sort of the origins of sort of putting this together. Yeah. So when I launched my coaching consulting practice, one of the things that was suggested to me was, you should do a research project, sort of come up with your own formula or approach. And I reflected on my own sort of background, and I'm what I call a sort of a third culture leader. I don't know if you've ever heard of third culture kids. Yeah. So I have one parent from one continent, a parent from a different continent, and I've grown up in places I'm also not from. And so I think that it's always been really interesting moving through the world, because people see me, they look at my name, and then they sort of have expectations about how I should sound, or what I should look like, or what I should value. And I really saw that come to life in the workplace when I had the opportunity to join sort of that clone factory, launch this real estate classifieds portal. And then I actually later took on another the same real estate portal, but in a different country. And so it was a very interesting, I guess, experiment in a way, because people would react and respond to me very interestingly. And so sort of taking that experience, and then I spoke to a bunch of other, what I call sort of third culture leaders, and leaders who were either what people would describe as sort of returnees or repats or expats. And so I was just really interested in their perception of how do they become successful? How do they define success in the workplace? How do they become successful in the workplace as they're engaging with people who might have preconceived notions? And we all have preconceived notions about each other. Even if we come from the same place, we all have preconceived notions about each other. But I just think it's a really interesting set of people, because it's a set I kind of belong to. And so through asking them questions, I sort of got to this point where everyone kind of just said they were constantly checking in with themselves, constantly cultivating their awareness, constantly trying to figure out what do I need? How do I make the most of this? How am I showing up? What resources do I need? How do I feel today? And once again, I think this is something I was just doing naturally as well earlier in my career without even recognizing it. And then the second piece really was, hey, I kind of have an idea of where I am right now. It might shift, right? And I think that's a huge thing sometimes for leaders to wrap their heads around. What you need or needed yesterday might not be what you need today. And that's the reason why you do need to have habits and rituals. It can be as simple as just taking a deep breath in the morning and just asking myself, how do I feel today? Right? But you need some way of just cultivating your awareness, right? So you can figure out what resources you need in both your personal and your professional life. And when you kind of have a way of doing that, you can then be a lot more intentional about how you decide to engage. Might be similar to what maybe some people talk about as, deciding to respond versus react, right? There are going to be times where you just react. That's absolutely fine. But what I'm talking about, okay, when we have a little bit of that awareness, how do we want to show up?
Mm-hmm.
How do we want to show up for ourselves? How do we want to show up for others? And that was something that I kept hearing a lot of these leaders talk about, like this really importance of being intentional, because they too had assumptions and that they were aware of that they had to work through because they were in a new environment that wasn't their previous environment, right? And then that last piece of it, that calibrate expectations piece, once again is like, okay, I'm aware, right, of where I am. This is not my previous place. So I might need to think about pivoting or shifting, adapting, or being flexible in this way. So what that means is I might need to shift my expectations about what I need to do. And maybe I even need to be more explicit. So another thing I talk a lot about with a lot of the leaders I work with, this idea of like implicit, explicit. So like you need to like, as opposed to assuming that people maybe know what you want, especially if you're in a new environment with a new culture, you might need to be more explicit about it, right? Because people can't read your mind. And so this is what I was hearing a lot of these people talk about. And that really is sort of, I would say, the first variable of this leadership cycle, the first element really of it, recognizing that we're constantly going through these stages of cultivating our awareness, deciding how to engage. For a lot of the leaders I work with, I describe it as simplifying engagement, simply because a lot of them are very overwhelmed and they think they have to do all the things. But it can be as simple as just choosing that next best step. And then that last piece really is calibrating expectations. Right. And this is something that we are constantly doing. And I think that third culture leaders are doing this even more, maybe simply because like they're constantly like having to remind themselves, okay, this is a different space. Like I might have to, show up a little bit differently. And so how do we do that? And so that's kind of, how you kind of, I guess you can say, sort of move through the cycle. And then I've sort of added some additional elements to it. So when I'm typically talking about it or sort of sharing with other people, I typically talk about that stage of having the capacity to engage with others. So this would kind of be like the second. It's not exactly linear, even though I'm talking about it in a linear way. You can be in any one of these spaces at any point in time. But if you're in a space where I describe you are somewhat stable, that means that you've been able to cultivate your awareness to some extent. You have the capacity to engage with others. Right?
Yeah.
If you're at a point where maybe you're what I call buoyant, you might want to continue to cultivate your self-awareness. You might want to check in to be like, ooh, what do I need? What's happening? Okay. And then last but not least, if you're in the transformative stage, it might be time to rethink or recalibrate your expectations. Maybe you're asking too much of yourself. Maybe you're asking too much of others. Maybe you need to find someone on your team who can be more detail-oriented and implementation focused, because you're more of a visionary person, right? There's an opportunity here maybe to do something different. So that's kind of like the first layer of the leadership sort of cycle. And that's what I call sort of the stages. And so you move through the stages by cultivating your awareness, simplifying engagement, and then calibrating expectations. And then there's sort of a second layer, I will say, adds a bit of complexity.
That's okay.
But that second layer is what I call leadership conditions. I'm not going to dive into the different conditions, but I've identified 4. There's a lot more. So it's sort of generalized, like any sort of format like this would be. But I think the key thing to keep in mind as it relates to these conditions is that they're both internal and external conditions. And so what that means is internally, right, you have your beliefs, you have your assumptions, you have your internal narratives and your habits and routines. And then I think something that we also need to consider is that sometimes there are external conditions. And this relates more to the environment that you might find yourself in and the stakeholders around you as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the sort of the 2 kind of pieces. And then what I've done is sort of generalized 4 different leadership conditions as it relates to that.
Yeah, this is so good. And I love how you framed it in terms of where you got this data from. So like the very beginning on talking to leaders and actually getting the information from the people doing the work as opposed to from a textbook, which isn't bad. But I love that it was like real live information that you talk to people about, and then you were able to then take that and put it into a framework to teach others, which is excellent. And so one kind of through line that I'm hearing through a lot of this is that self-awareness. And I feel like as leaders, sometimes we get so into the day-to-day or into the do that we forget to take that pause and, kind of check in and even notice what's happening. So being self-aware sounds like the foundation of all of this in order to even know kind of which phase you're in or which part of the wave you're in or which cycle. Does that feel right? Yeah.
100%. I mean, I sometimes tell people, who are interested in working with me as a coach specifically that like people pay me to reflect.
Yes.
Right. I work with a lot of, like you said, overwhelmed, overstretched, and they just need a space to sit down and just honestly reflect. Because sometimes for some leaders, they can't even honor that space to reflect in their own calendar, and they need to go outside themselves to be able to make that happen.
Yeah. And that accountability, I mean, what a gift to have that accountability and have somebody else be that mirror and be that reflection to provide the self-awareness to even know where you are and what stage and how you can improve your leadership skills for yourself and your team. So the other thing that came to mind as you were talking is that, and I don't know if you've ever thought this in your career, but I have, that there's no finish line. So I like how you think about it as a cycle and this wave, because there isn't a finish line. And I think I thought 100%. This so many times in my career, and there really isn't. It really is that cycle. And I relate career to even the cycles of nature. We need seasons of rest. We need seasons of growth. Same kind of thought process here is that there really is no finish line. And as leaders, we need to understand that and to know that we are going to go through these different stages and these different cycles throughout our entire career.
Definitely, even within a day.
Yeah,
I think.
Right.
And I think once again, it's something to normalize.
Yes.
Right. You could start the day feeling like I'm the greatest person ever. And towards middle of the day, I can't get that done. So I need to be able to delegate effectively.
Yeah.
Because I've realized that I can't work through this. I need support.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point that it can change day to day. It can change hour to hour. There's so much going on usually. So, and I even think about too, there's been times in my career where I was in kind of what I would call a turnaround situation where, a facility was not performing where the organization expected it to. And as leaders, we had to go in and turn it around and make sure we were listening to people and understanding what the pain points were. And when you're in a situation like that, it's pretty intense. And you're going to go through all of those stages, pretty much in a day, probably, because there's so much work that has to be done. And so, but going back to that self-awareness, also knowing when you're in a turnaround, a very intense situation like that, being self-aware and understanding what you kind of bring to the table and that you are going to fluctuate and you're human, and to normalize all of that, I think is a big piece of the process. So I really appreciate that. One of the things, speaking of normalizing, one of the things that I love about what I know about your work too, is that you normalize the messy parts of leadership. So one of those conditions, I believe, is firefighting. Is that right? And so that is a thing. And I actually felt something inside of me when I was reading about that, because it's okay to be in that stage. It's just a matter of recognizing it and moving through it. So tell me more about that.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. So there are 4 leadership conditions really quickly. The first, and I'm thinking about potentially renaming this, but the first I sort of say thriving. It's not like you're at 100%, but it's simply that there's an opportunity here for you to lean in to whatever stage you're in, whether it's buoyant, transformative, or stable. Right.
Yep.
And then we have what I call reluctance. And so I used to call myself the reluctant leader. Right. And a lot of times these are, leaders who get to where they are, maybe because they're really technical. They know how to do the things. And then they're pushed into people leadership. However, they think that there's only one way to do things. And then you have what I call the overwhelmed leaders. And then finally, I also have sort of this other condition, and I call it sort of the firefighting leader. And this is a leader who really just sort of believes that, hey, I got to be involved in all the things. I have to do all the things. But like you rightfully said, I think we have to go through all of these and a lot more.
Right.
And I think the key is to be able to acknowledge that, hey, I'm doing this thing. It might not be in my best interest, and it might not be in the best interest of this organization I'm working for. So what's possible? How can I do things differently? And so typically when we talk about firefighting, a lot of the reasons why we decide to firefight is because we maybe feel like we don't have the trust, or we think that people can't do it as well as us. And so a huge piece of that is being able to connect or engage, right, with our team members. Maybe a piece of it's also understanding hey, what can I contribute? How can we connect, or how can we engage with our team members to better understand how they can contribute? And then ultimately, how can we build processes so that I don't necessarily have to be a part of everything? But once again, you have to be in a space where you're willing to have that reflection, and be open to do something different. And it's not always easy. Sometimes I tell leaders, unfortunately, they have to hit a brick wall or something unfortunate kind of has to happen in order for them to be willing to change. Because if something's worked in the past, until sometimes leaders have some evidence, and unfortunately, it's not really great to get that evidence, but until sometimes they have like some hard evidence, they're not willing to shift or do something different.
Yes. And I think of even early career leader or somebody that's a leader that's going into a new environment where they might be in that firefighting stage in the beginning because they're learning, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they don't have to have all the answers. I guess I really just felt so seen when I saw that, because I think obviously I've been in that stage before and I felt like it was a failure. And it really wasn't a failure. It's more hey, we are going into this situation. We are going to be firefighting until we figure it out. And often, and I guess just hearing what you're saying is that it can be a signal. It's a signal that change
I think that's a good
has to happen, or there's too much complexity, or there's an opportunity to simplify, like you were talking about earlier. So it's really a signal. And then once you recognize it, you can put the processes in place, like you said, to stop the firefighting or to control the firefighting. And it's more fire prevention, right? So we're putting things that stopped to put out the fires, and then we move to fire prevention, right? So yeah,
I really love how you put that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Because for me, the one that resonates the most is the overwhelmed leader.
Yeah.
So when I look back at when I had the opportunity to build a team, I built it very organically. So it was always just okay, there's way too much work for us. Yeah. We need to bring someone on. So like you said, there's this element of we have to acknowledge, this is different. This is feeling a little tight. What can we do differently? Right. And so for me, a lot of the times when I was working full time, it was more of this overwhelmed feeling, I can do something about it, right? I can maybe bring somebody on, or we have to say no to new opportunities to make sure that we have the capacity.
Yes, absolutely. And then last point here is when you get to that point where you are thriving, when you feel like things are like that well-oiled machine, which probably doesn't happen forever or, an extended period of time, but then at least you get to recognize it. Again, going back to that awareness, pausing and recognizing it, knowing that it's there for you. And then I guess also noticing the differences between the overwhelm and the firefighting, and then knowing kind of, hey, we can fix this and get back to a place where we're more often than not in that thriving stage. So yeah, I love thinking about it that way. So, and it's not, and none of them are a failure. You will consistently go through each and every one of them, as you grow. And that's part of the fun of growth, right? That's part of the fun of career too. So now we've talked about this cycle showing up in individuals, but it also, you talk about, can show up as organizations and within culture. So, and I kind of think about this, just what I was describing before, that turnaround situation where, nothing's clicking. We got to come in and kind of figure out what's going on. So talk to me about that. Have you seen companies or cultures move through stages as well?
Definitely. Yeah. So I'll say I don't always explicitly talk about these stages with my clients. So this is something that I'm sort of
in your
using
head. Yeah, exactly.
To help orient myself. But definitely, right. I can even think of an organization I'm working with right now where I think there's even sort of a disconnect between what maybe the leadership thinks is happening and sort of what the leaders feel is happening as well. And I think that that's a huge piece for us to keep in mind as we're cultivating awareness, right? If we're talking about it from the leader level, we're even talking about at a certain level of the organization versus the actual employees, they might feel ooh, I'm in a space where I'm super overwhelmed. And then the leadership might feel I'm firefighting. I have to do all the things, right? But because there is no communication, or maybe there's no trust, it's not being communicated across, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the employees are yes, I do want to help. However, I'm feeling really overwhelmed because of how, leadership is firefighting, and they're not trusting us, and they're telling us one thing, but then they're changing their mind. So yeah, I think definitely organizations can find themselves in any one of these stages. And I think more importantly, or any one of these conditions. Yeah. However, I think what's more important than trying to, for the lack of a better word, diagnose what condition you're in, I think it's more important to make sure that you have habits, routines, rituals at the organization, department, or team level that allows you to go through cultivating awareness, thinking about how to engage, and then ultimately calibrating expectations, right? Yes. And this is something I talk with leaders all the time. It's not important, it's not that it's not important, but I don't think it's a good use of your time to human beings, we are really complicated. Organizations are really complicated. Like there's so many different pieces. However, can we create momentum through making sure that we're checking in and deciding how we want to show up? And then we check in to see, hey, did this work? And then we can decide how we want to show up.
Yes.
I think having that cadence is a lot more important than being able to like point out like, oh, on February 2nd, we were at this type of organization and all these details that maybe could be useful to some extent, but we might just be focused so much on this granular data and we're not really focused on like, are we making progress? Do we have momentum? Do we have a system to help us move forward?
Yeah, those systems and processes to kind of keep the communication flowing. I think about like those daily stand-ups and, you know, communication is something that just, if it's not in place, if those mechanisms are not in place, like nothing works. And making sure everybody's on the same page with the way that the team or the organization communicates is also really important because there are so many ways to communicate and there are so many dispersed teams now, you know, remote and throughout the world. It just makes it extra important. Now with AI coming into the picture, it's just going to be even extra and more important than ever, I think, is going to be the communication mechanisms and those processes to make sure everybody's on the same page. And I also, when you were talking too, I was even thinking about like cycles of organizations, like you were talking about a startup, like the early stage, the growth stage, the scaling stage. So there's also those cycles that organizations are going to go through as well. Exactly. Yeah, they're going to go through that as well. So it's really interesting, you know, to kind of think about, I guess I just love this concept of cycles in leadership and organizations and growth and development and learning. And so it's interesting to think about the different perspectives for it. So cultures aren't static, people aren't static, everybody evolves. That's the beauty of it. So now many folks that are listening, as I was mentioning to you, are heart-based professionals who start to feel like they've outgrown something. So maybe they've outgrown a role, a team, or even an identity that they built around their career. So I was just curious, like what your thoughts are around that, or if you've seen that show up in different leaders and growth cycles and what comes to mind for that.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely something I've seen. Definitely something that I even think about, even though I've been working for myself for like almost 8 years. Like every year I kind of want to have like, ooh, what is it that's going to bring me excitement? Where am I going to grow? What am I going to learn?
Yes.
So I think the fact that you're even aware of it, I think already is a plus because some people are working so hard, are just so focused like on the rat race and getting things done. They just are like, something feels wrong, right? So maybe they like can feel that something's off, but they can't even put words to it because they don't have the space to be able to take a breath and even be like, oh yeah, this is what's wrong. Like I need growth in this, or I need a shift, or I need to change. And so what comes up for me, I guess, is sort of the first element that I talked about. But once again, it can come at any point, any one of these sort of stages. But I think the first element is sort of asking yourself, like, how can I continue to wrap my head around sort of what's happening and what might be interesting to me, right? So really that awareness piece, I think, is going to be really important to start off with. So how can I reflect a little bit more on this? How can I get a little bit more clarity on what my next steps could look like?
Yeah.
And then it's maybe along the lines of, okay, who can I maybe talk to? Right? What do I want to do differently? Is it about finding a completely new opportunity, or is it about maybe adding something that brings me more joy or lights me up in a different way?
Love that. Yeah.
And then, of course, we sort of close out, of course, always with that expectation setting piece that I think is really important. And as I reflect on this particular example that you shared, like, I think one thing that a lot of people I've worked with in the past and, leaders I've worked with even this year, like one thing that they're wrapping their heads around is that like work doesn't have to be everything. So like, what are the stories we tell ourselves about, our jobs, our titles? Does it have to be the end all be all, or can it be just a part of different things that you do? I think another conversation I think that's really interesting that a lot of people are having or have been having is this idea of like, work can just be for money. Is that wrong? And can I sort of get my, my sense of self from something else?
Yes.
And I think that's really around that expectation setting piece that might need to be recalibrated. So what are the stories we're telling ourselves, about our roles, about our careers, and are they serving us? I think.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what comes to mind first.
Yeah, I think those are all awesome points. And I literally was DMing somebody about that today, about the fact that she's at this point in her career and she's like, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. And it's the title and it's the team and it's all the things and it's not fulfilling her. And I talk about career in seasons, and what's most important in this season of career might be different from 2 years ago. And that's okay. And we grow and evolve as humans. And, maybe you're in a season where work is just for money right now, and that's fine. And maybe in a few years, that'll shift again. And so it's going back to that self-awareness and that recalibration, and having the space and the rituals and the habits and all the things to allow for that in order to do that recalibration. So you don't get to the point where you're completely exhausted and burnt out and on autopilot and all the things that we know can happen. So yeah, really, really good thoughts. Now, my kind of what we were talking about here and where my head was going when I was thinking about this conversation too, is this whole idea, and you kind of touched on it here around this like success. And I don't even think, I think success is different for a lot of people in today's world of work. And I think that's going to continue to evolve. But as I was thinking about leadership as a cycle and careers as a cycle, this whole idea of like up and to the right, that we're so used to is gone. Like it's not there anymore. Yeah. There's like over 12,000 job titles. Like it's just not a thing. And so I would love your thoughts just from, kind of what you've observed or what you think success means in today's world of work.
Oh, that's a really great question. And I think everyone has to define it for themselves.
They do.
Like, I think I'm very clear on what success looks like for me. And I always want to invite anyone I'm ever working with, or any session that I'm facilitating, or any container I'm co-creating, to invite them to also reflect on what success looks like. And to me, the success, or defining what success looks like, that's the expectation setting piece too, that I talk about in sort of that leadership cycle. And then recognizing that, for some people, they are, their default is to define what success looks like maybe 5 years from now, right? Maybe more visionary, more long-term thinkers. Others they're more like present, like I want this today. And so I think another interesting piece is also maybe like, hey, what's your default? Where do you tend to fall? And is there an opportunity here for you to think about it maybe from a different sort of longitudinal time sort of period, and what comes up for you there? Or is there a tool or resource you can leverage to support you with maybe seeing it from a different time period? And does that bring up anything that's different or interesting or useful for you? For me, I think that, and I think a piece of it maybe is, like I said, I've had this really bizarre sort of career. I think that I'm quite privileged in many ways. And I think for me, success has always been, but once again, I think only recently I've been able to, I have the language to be able to sort of talk through it. But success for me very much is a feeling. I think that I'm just constantly looking for this. I love a challenge. Yes. And I think, another one of my values is like, I love a challenge. And the work I do is just challenging. I have no idea what people are going to say. I have no idea. And I just love that. I kind of get a high from it to some extent. So maybe it's not, maybe it's not good, but to me, I was like, it really seems good. At least like unharmful for the most part.
Yeah, no, I think
I'm constantly seeking a challenge. I'm constantly seeking the opportunity to grow. And the work I do day to day allows me to do that. Just naturally. And then there's this other component of like, I'm always just reading. And recently I've been wanting to learn how to write better about this work. And that's a challenge in a different way. But for me, definitely I'm always seeking an opportunity to grow. I'm always seeking an opportunity to be challenged. And yeah, I think any and everything I do has some element of that. So for me, success is having the opportunity to do those things. I'm also very process-oriented person. If you come to me and you're just like, the ends justify the means, I'd be like, no. If I didn't enjoy the journey, I don't care. Like I'm out. Like
I'm with you.
So I think for me, success also is, it's a quote actually. It's on the back of my. It's something I see every single day. It's a Dr. Maya Angelou quote. Yes. Success is liking yourself, liking what you do, and liking how you do it. And so for me, once again, it's not a title, it's not a position, it's not a specific place, it's not a person. I'm a very process-oriented person. And I think that sort of comes through, right? I want to be able to grow through the process. I want to be able to be challenged. And through that I think I get some level of joy, this feeling of success. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it strokes my ego too. I have no idea. Yeah.
It's a breath of fresh air. And it just sounds like it's more developmental and growth oriented than anything else, which we all need that because that's where careers are going in this world of work. And so a couple of things I just want to point out that were really interesting and for listeners just to kind of maybe think about too is love the time period, so like what's your default in terms of like a time period today? Are you thinking about today? Or are you the visionary person? And maybe maybe swap those. Like if you're the visionary person, maybe think about today and what does success look like for you today? I love that thought. And the other thing that you mentioned too was your values. So you know your values, you know what's important to you, and that triggers what success looks like for you. And I think that is so important. And for just, again, for people to pause and know what's important in this season of career, and then identifying like, what does success look like based on what's important to me, not what society says, not what my friends are doing, not what my, coworkers, whatever. It's very important to you in your season of career. And that Maya Angelou quote, mic drop, we need to put that everywhere. So thank you. So as we come to a close, a question I love asking everybody is for a flourishing favorite. So a book, a podcast, or a resource that has had an impact on your career, and why would you recommend it to others?
These two women who had a podcast that was called Duped, The Dark Side of Online Business. And so course creators, online businesses, that was massive when I first started my practice. And so that was 2018. And then it got even bigger at the pandemic. Now it's died down. Like, it's really interesting to see how, once again, everything is cycles. Things go up and down.
There you go. Yep.
However, this particular podcast was just really helpful because I also started to question, like, okay, am I a grifter? Like, I'm no one's, like, I've never said I was anyone's guru. Like, what is this? And I really enjoyed listening to this particular podcast because it was really interesting to sort of hear their perspective, hear them also grapple with similar questions and sort of work through it, and also sort of identify different things that they're seeing online in terms of trends, how service providers like us, put together sales pages, their terms and conditions, right? I think I learned a lot. And I think a lot of my ideas about how I wanted to show up online, because I do the majority of my work online. A piece of it's because of where I decide to live and who wants to pay me. Don't so happen to be in the same geographic area. So I'm just making the most of the technology that exists. And so, I think kind of being in their orbit, so listening to their podcast. I think each of them also have their own podcast that I've listened to at some point in time, has really helped me wrap my head around how do I want to show up as a predominantly like online business. So that I think is a podcast that's been really helpful for my growth, I think, as a business owner, and I'm continuing to grow. So there's things that I'm being like, nope, I'm not going to do that anymore, or nope, that's not how I want to show up. And then maybe, there are also some things that I'm trying as well. But that podcast in particular, I think, has been really helpful.
Oh, I can't wait to check it out. Thank you for sharing. And I think like two things that were coming to mind there is, one, how cool is it that we can learn from these amazing humans through podcasting? Obviously we're on a podcast right now, so we might be biased, but I think it's pretty cool. I think I learned everything about starting a business through podcasts. Like, that was my main form of learning. And so just so cool that we can do that. And then second, the world of online business. Like, how cool is it that we can work with people in different countries? Like, here you and I are even in different countries having a chat together. And it's just so awesome that our world of work allows that. And it's just going to be even more so as we continue. So, and it's always going to evolve and change. So going back to the cycle, like, it's always going to evolve and ebb and flow like the waves and like nature and everything we've been talking about today. So, really, really great thoughts. Akua, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all this wisdom. It has been such a delight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a ton of fun. Thank you.
You're welcome. And where can people find you on the speaking of online world, where can people find you?
So I would say the primary platform that I use is LinkedIn. So feel free to send me a DM on LinkedIn. And then, of course, I have my website, which is simply just, my name. So akuanm.com.
Perfect. We will make sure those links are in the notes for folks to connect with you. And listeners, as always, the notes from today's episode will be on the blog at flourish.careers/blog. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.